She was only 14, a girl standing on the delicate line between childhood and womanhood, with eyes as wide and gentle as the morning sky and a heart as pure as flowing water. Her laughter, though seldom heard, had the kind of sweetness that softened even the hardest hearts among the villagers who occasionally caught her smile. Yet her life inside her own home was far from gentle. She lived under the roof of her stepmother, a woman whose sharp tongue cut deeper than any blade and whose heart seemed carved from stone. Still, despite the coldness pressed upon her each day, the girl never let bitterness nestle in her spirit. Instead, she clung to kindness as if it were her only true possession, giving what little she had to others, offering smiles when her soul longed to cry, and dreaming of a day when freedom might kiss her weary life. Every morning before dawn, she rose quietly, wrapping her thin shawl around her fragile shoulders, and began her work while the rest of the household still slept. She swept the compound until the dust rose like small clouds in the pale light, she fetched water from the river though the jar was nearly as heavy as her arms could carry, and she tended to the goats with soft patience, whispering to them as though they were the only friends who listened. She bore her burdens without complaint, though her stepmother's eyes were always upon her, watching not with care but with the hunger to find fault. And faults were always found, whether it was the imagined slowness of her sweeping, the unnoticed crack in the pot, or the simple way she moved her hands. Each mistake was magnified, each error punished with harsh words or cruel tasks. Yet the girl's spirit did not break. In the quiet of her chores, she hummed to herself, weaving little songs of hope that no one else could hear. She dreamed of a world where she could walk freely beyond the village paths, where her days were not bound by commands, and where love did not come laced with scorn. She longed to feel the warmth of true affection, a kind that would not vanish with her mother's passing, a love that could anchor her against the storms of cruelty. The villagers sometimes wondered at her resilience. When she went to the river, some of the women noticed how she always helped the younger children fill their pots first, even when her own jar remained empty. When the old man who lived alone at the edge of the village struggled with firewood, she quietly left bundles at his doorstep, never once asking for thanks. And when other children mocked her ragged clothes or whispered about her stepmother's harshness, she bore it with patience, her lips pressed into a soft smile though her heart throbbed with pain. But behind this gentle face was a girl who felt deeply the sting of neglect. At night, when the house grew silent, she often curled herself into the farthest corner of her mat, staring into the darkness, wondering why she had been left with a woman who showed her no mercy. She whispered questions into the still air, asking the spirits of her ancestors if they could see her suffering, if her late mother still remembered her, if anyone beyond the stars cared for the ache in her young heart. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, unseen by all but the shadows that kept her company. Her stepmother treated her less like a daughter and more like a servant, and her step-siblings mirrored the same disdain. They jeered at her, pushed their chores onto her shoulders, and laughed when exhaustion bent her back. To them, she was nothing but a shadow in the house, a tool to be used until it broke. Yet even as her heart ached, she never retaliated. She carried their cruelty with quiet endurance, believing that patience was a shield even if fragile. Despite it all, the girl's longing for love and freedom burned like a hidden flame within her. Sometimes when she worked in the fields, she lifted her gaze to the horizon, imagining herself walking beyond the borders of the village, where no one knew her as the stepmother's drudge but as herself, a girl with dreams, with laughter, with a name worth cherishing. She dreamed of dancing barefoot in the rain without fear of scolding, of singing songs without being told to hush, of sitting by a fire surrounded by warmth that came not from flames but from hearts. This longing kept her alive, though every day seemed to chip away at her. The cruelty of her stepmother could bruise her body and weigh down her heart, but it could not extinguish the quiet fire of hope that burned inside. In her innocence, she still believed in a tomorrow that could be better than today. And though she did not yet know it, her gentleness, her resilience, and her unbroken spirit would one day become the roots of a strength that even her enemies could not crush. The stepmother's hatred did not arrive like a sudden storm. It grew slowly, like a creeping vine winding itself around her heart until it strangled all sense of fairness. From the moment the girl's mother had passed away, leaving her young and vulnerable, the stepmother had seen her not as a child to care for but as a burden and, more dangerously, as a threat. Each passing year sharpened that feeling, for the girl's gentle beauty began to blossom despite the hardships she endured. Her features softened with youth, her eyes glowed with quiet strength, and her kindness shone like a hidden jewel. Where the stepmother's own children seemed loud, selfish, or clumsy, the girl appeared graceful even in rags, humble even when mistreated, and that contrast gnawed at the woman's pride. At first, the cruelties were small, perhaps disguised as strictness. A forgotten meal, harsher chores, a slap for mistakes that were never truly hers. But the longer she watched the girl endure these slights without complaint, the more the stepmother felt an uneasy fear grow inside her. Fear that one day the villagers would compare her own children to this quiet stepdaughter and find them wanting. Fear that the girl's beauty would draw admiration, sympathy, or even suitors, while her own daughters remained overlooked. Fear that the spirit of the girl's late mother lived on through her, an unseen presence reminding the stepmother that she could never truly replace the love that once filled the household. Her greed deepened this hatred. She wanted her own children to inherit everything: respect, affection, wealth, and future security. But the girl's presence was like a shadow she could not erase. Whenever the villagers praised the stepmother's generosity, someone would inevitably mention the girl's patience or her grace, reminding everyone that cruelty had not succeeded in breaking her. Whenever the stepmother tried to elevate her own children, the girl's quiet dignity seemed to outshine them without her ever trying. This infuriated the woman, for nothing stung her pride more than the idea of being eclipsed by someone she despised. Her hatred began to leak into daily life in ways that only grew sharper. She made the girl's food smaller, thinner portions of porridge barely enough to keep her strong for the endless chores. She gave her the heaviest tasks, sending her to fetch water from the farthest well, forcing her to grind grain until her palms blistered, or keeping her in the fields until the sun burned her skin. When the girl's hands cracked from washing clothes in cold water, the stepmother sneered that she was clumsy. When her body trembled with exhaustion, she mocked her for being weak. No act of effort was ever enough. No task was done to satisfaction. But these cruelties, as bitter as they were only fragments of something darker. The stepmother began to whisper to herself in the night, muttering plans and complaints like poison seeping from her lips. Sometimes her children overheard and joined in, mocking the girl and feeding the fire of resentment that had already consumed their mother. Other times she would watch the girl with narrowed eyes, studying her movements, her growing beauty, her unbroken spirit, as if searching for the one way she might finally crush her once and for all. The villagers noticed her harshness but said little. Some pitied the girl but turned their eyes away, unwilling to interfere in another family's affairs. Others whispered about the stepmother's bitterness but excused it as grief or strictness. Their silence gave her more power, for cruelty left unchecked only grows bolder. She began to treat the girl not as a child of her household but as an unwanted intruder, a constant reminder of her own insecurities. There were moments when the stepmother's fear seemed almost like superstition. She saw how the girl's kindness drew animals near, how children clung to her, how even elders nodded at her respectful greetings, and she began to fear that there was something more than human in her. Perhaps, she thought, the spirits of her ancestors walked with her. Perhaps destiny favored her in ways that no cruelty could erase. And that thought made the stepmother tremble with rage, for what she could not control, she sought to destroy. The small cruelties became larger. She began denying the girl warmth at night, keeping the blanket for her own children and letting the girl shiver in the cold. She sent her on errands in dangerous places, hoping accidents might finish what she dared not do openly. She told lies about her to others, painting her as disobedient or lazy, though the villagers who saw her daily life knew better. Yet the more she tried to tarnish the girl's image, the more fate seemed to polish her innocence until it shone brighter. This contrast hardened the stepmother's resolve. Each day she studied the girl with eyes that no longer held annoyance but calculation. Small cruelties had not been enough. Fear alone would not keep her destiny at bay. If she truly wished to secure her own power and ensure her children's future, she would need to go beyond daily punishments. She would need a plan that would end the girl's presence once and for all. And so, behind her cold eyes and sharpened tongue, she began to weave a plot. It would be subtle enough to escape suspicion, cruel enough to satisfy her bitterness, and final enough that the girl would never again rise to cast her shadow upon her house. Though the girl still carried out her chores, still sang softly to herself while sweeping, and still dreamed of freedom, she had no way of knowing that her stepmother's heart had already chosen the path of destruction. The small cruelties she endured were only the whispers of something darker, the early echoes of a plan that would soon unfold with deadly intent. The stepmother, driven by years of envy and bitterness, had finally devised her plan. She could no longer bear to watch the girl walk with grace, even under hardship, nor endure the way others sometimes whispered about the girl's quiet beauty, her gentle spirit that seemed to outshine the malice directed at her. Every time the girl's kindness softened a stranger's heart or her resilience stirred admiration, the stepmother felt her own place in the world shrinking, as though the young one's mere existence robbed her of power. And so, she set her mind on ending the girl's life, a decision as cold as the night sky without stars. She began carefully, weaving her schemes with subtlety. She spoke sweetly, masking her poison behind smiles that concealed sharp teeth. "Come with me, child," she would say, her voice dipped in honey, though her heart was full of venom. The girl, still naive in some ways despite her suffering, often felt a flicker of hope when her stepmother's tone softened. Could it be, she wondered, that the cruel woman might one day see her as a daughter? Could there be space for warmth in a heart that had long been cold? But such hope was only a doorway to deeper betrayal. The first attempt came in the form of food. The stepmother prepared a stew, its aroma rich and inviting. She served it to the girl herself, encouraging her with false kindness to eat more than usual. But as the girl raised the spoon to her lips, a strange unease gripped her. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps the whisper of unseen ancestors, but she felt her throat tighten before the poison could do its work. She pushed the bowl aside, feigning fullness. The stepmother's eyes narrowed for the briefest second, but she quickly masked her disappointment. The girl had escaped, though unknowingly, and the plan would have to be tried again. The second attempt was even more sinister. One evening, the stepmother led her deep into the woods under the pretense of gathering herbs. The girl followed obediently, carrying a basket, unaware of the malice shadowing each step. When they reached a lonely clearing, the stepmother pointed to a patch of green at the edge of a shallow pit. "Go," she urged, "pluck those leaves for me. They are rare and your hands are better suited for it." Trusting and weary, the girl bent forward, stepping closer to the pit's edge. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, loosened soil that had been deliberately prepared days before. She fell, her body crashing against the earth, pain tearing through her bones. The stepmother looked down at her, a grim satisfaction hardening her features. Without hesitation, she began covering the pit with branches and soil, leaving the girl trapped, her cries muffled by layers of earth and betrayal. Hours passed in suffocating darkness. The girl clawed at the dirt, her nails breaking, her body weak. Each breath burned, filled with dust and despair. She thought of the small joys she had clung to, the songs she hummed while working, the rare moments when villagers' children smiled at her, the dreams she carried in silence. Was this how it would end? Buried not by nature but by malice, her life cut short not by fate but by cruelty? Tears mixed with the soil on her face, but still she fought, even as her strength waned. Somewhere deep within her heart, a spark refused to die. When the night fell and the air grew colder, her consciousness flickered. She could hear faint sounds, perhaps the rustle of spirits moving through the trees, perhaps only her mind slipping into visions. But even in that near-death state, she sensed she was not entirely alone. The darkness pressed heavily around her, the earth sealing her in a suffocating embrace, but her spirit, though fragile, still clung to the thin thread of existence. Back above the ground, the stepmother walked away without a glance behind, her lips twisted in grim triumph. She thought the girl's life had ended there, buried beneath dirt and silence. She imagined herself free of the shadow of innocence, free of the quiet strength that had always reminded others of her own failings. But what she did not know was that her cruelty had only planted a seed, one that would soon grow into something far beyond her control. The girl's body lay weakened, broken by betrayal, but her soul had begun to stir with something ancient. The earth pressed close, but within that suffocating darkness, a strange power had awakened. Though she did not yet understand it, though her heart still trembled in fear, this near-death suffering was only the beginning. The attempt to kill her had not ended her story, it had ignited a fire that would one day consume those who had wronged her. Buried beneath the weight of soil and betrayal, the girl lay still, her breath shallow, her body trembling with exhaustion. Every part of her cried out in pain, every gasp felt like fire in her chest. She had been left for dead, hidden under the earth by the very woman who was meant to protect her, and the world above seemed to have forgotten her existence. Yet within that suffocating darkness, something began to stir, something that even her stepmother's cruelty could not silence. It was not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a heartbeat reminding her that she still belonged to life. At first, her survival seemed impossible. Dirt pressed against her chest, her limbs were stiff, and her lungs screamed for air. She clawed upward, her broken nails scraping against the soil, and though the weight was unbearable, she refused to stop. Images of her past filled her mind, her laughter as a child before her father's absence left her vulnerable, the warmth of a song she used to hum when no one was listening, the secret longing she had carried for freedom, love, and a life beyond cruelty. These memories wrapped around her like threads of light in the dark, pushing her to fight harder than she ever had before. But her will alone was not enough. As her strength began to wane, she felt something strange, something not of the flesh but of the spirit. At first, it was a whisper, faint but clear, calling her name as though carried through the very soil. Then came the sensation of warmth, as if hands older than time itself were lifting her, steadying her, reminding her she was not alone. Ancestral spirits, the guardians of the innocent, had come to her aid. Their voices filled her with visions. Women before her who had suffered injustice, girls who had been silenced, yet whose spirits lived on. They pressed their strength into her frail body, reminding her that her pain was not an end but a beginning. With this newfound force she pushed once more. The soil seemed to loosen slightly, as if responding to her determination, as if the earth itself had been moved by her suffering. Each motion was agony, each breath shallow, but her will no longer belonged only to her, it was now tied to something greater. Her hands broke through the packed soil, clawing at the surface, and she felt the cool night air seep in through her fingertips. The taste of that air was sharper, sweeter than anything she had known. She gasped, coughed, and pulled herself upward inch by inch, until at last her head emerged from the grave. The moon hung above her, casting its pale light onto her mud-streaked face. For a long moment she lay still, trembling, staring at the sky with wide, teary eyes. She had been buried alive, abandoned, condemned, but here she was breathing again. Her heart thumped violently, not with fear but with the dawning realization of her survival. She had faced death and returned, and though her body was weak, her spirit felt unbreakable. As she pulled herself completely from the grave, collapsing onto the ground, she thought of her stepmother. The woman had believed the earth would claim her, that silence would erase her existence. But the girl knew now that no cruelty could erase what the spirits had chosen to preserve. She was alive not by accident, not by chance, but because something greater than her enemies had decreed it so. She lay in the grass, staring at the stars, her chest rising and falling in uneven but determined breaths. The world felt sharper, more alive. She could hear the rustle of the trees, the call of nocturnal birds, even the faint hum of insects, as though every sound carried a secret. Her senses had deepened, awakened by her brush with death. She began to understand that she was no longer the same girl who had once longed only for freedom. She was something more, someone marked, chosen, and reborn through trial. The night around her felt both eerie and protective. Shadows moved across the trees, and in them she thought she glimpsed the forms of ancestors watching her. Their eyes were not sorrowful but proud, as if they had been waiting for her to step into the destiny cruelty had unknowingly prepared her for. She whispered a broken thank you, her voice hoarse but filled with sincerity, and felt their presence linger, a promise that she was never truly alone. Though her body was battered, her heart burned with a quiet, dangerous fire. She had survived what no one was meant to survive. She had endured abandonment, suffocation, and betrayal, yet she walked out of it with breath still in her lungs. And in that survival, she found a strength she had never known she carried. The girl no longer thought only of escape or quiet endurance. A new thought began to form in her heart, sharp as a blade. If cruelty had sought to bury her, then she would rise with purpose. Her survival was not simply for herself, it was a gift from the spirits, and it demanded to be honored. Her stepmother had tried to kill her, but instead she had carved out a warrior, a vessel of strength, and a heart burning with resolve. By the time dawn approached, painting the sky with pale gold, the girl stood on her feet. Her clothes were torn, her skin caked with dirt, but her eyes glowed with something unshakable. She was no longer merely the innocent child of sorrow. She was the survivor, the one whom death itself could not keep. And in her survival, the first seeds of a deadly plan began to take root. When the girl closed her eyes after the night of her survival, she did not fall into ordinary sleep. Her body, weakened and trembling from the weight of soil and betrayal, drifted into a strange realm between dream and waking. There, she found herself standing on a vast plain lit not by sun or moon but by a glow that seemed to come from the earth itself. Around her moved shapes, tall and indistinct at first, but gradually forming into the faces of ancestors. Women with proud eyes, men with firm gazes, children whose laughter rang like bells carried on the wind. They surrounded her not as strangers but as family, as though their blood ran through her veins, reminding her of the lineage she carried. In that vision, their voices came together, not loud but resonant, as though echoing from the bones of the earth. They told her she had been chosen not merely to survive but to rise. They whispered of justice, of the balance of the world that had been tipped by her stepmother's cruelty. They told her that her pain was now her weapon, her suffering the fire that would harden her spirit into iron. The girl listened with tears rolling down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of recognition. For the first time in her life, she understood that her suffering had meaning, and that the spirits had saved her for something greater than silence. Night after night, her dreams deepened. She saw images of chains breaking, of fire burning away the lies of those who had condemned her. She saw her stepmother's face twist in terror as unseen hands bound her in the same darkness she had tried to bury her stepdaughter in. She saw villagers standing in awe, their silence finally shattered by the truth of her innocence. These visions were not simple fantasies born from a wounded heart. They carried weight, clarity, and the undeniable imprint of the spiritual realm. She woke each morning with the images etched into her mind, stronger than hunger, stronger than pain. During the quiet hours, as she sat by herself in the woods where no one dared to follow, she began to think, to shape the whispers into plans. She was no longer the helpless child who endured cruelty in silence. The earth had remade her, the spirits had given her back her breath, and now her thoughts sharpened like blades. She studied the rhythms of the village, when her stepmother left her hut, when the other women gathered, when the fires dimmed and the shadows grew long. She remembered every slight, every insult, every time her enemies laughed at her tears. But instead of weeping, she breathed in deeply, as though drawing strength from the very soil that had once tried to consume her. The voices inside her were no longer simply comforting. They grew firmer, instructive, as though guiding her hand. "Do not return as the child they despised," one said, its tone ancient and unyielding. "Return as the shadow they fear." Another voice whispered of patience, warning her that vengeance too quickly sought would burn out like dry grass in a storm. Her ancestors taught her to think not as prey but as a hunter who waits in silence until the moment is right. She listened, nodded, and let the wisdom sink into her bones. Her transformation began inwardly. Where once her heart trembled with fear, now it pulsed with determination. Her body was still fragile, scarred from her ordeal, but her spirit walked taller than ever before. She practiced moving quietly through the forest, stepping carefully as the hunters did, learning to listen to every sound as if the trees themselves spoke secrets. She gathered herbs she had once collected for chores, but now she studied them with new eyes, remembering which roots healed and which roots poisoned. She tied strands of grass into knots, practicing the patience of weaving traps, her hands steady though her mind burned with fury. And always at night the dreams returned. She saw herself not merely as a girl but as a force cloaked in shadow, her eyes burning like embers. She saw her stepmother begging for mercy that would never come. She saw the villagers bowing their heads, not in scorn but in reverence, acknowledging the girl they had once condemned. Each dream left her trembling when she woke, not from fear but from the raw power coursing through her. It was as though the spirits were sharpening her soul, piece by piece, until she became something her enemies could never have imagined. In these moments she also wrestled with herself. She remembered her innocence, her kindness, the part of her that once believed in love and compassion. At times she wondered if vengeance would corrupt her, if it would turn her into the same cruelty she despised. But each time she questioned, the visions grew clearer. This was not vengeance for its own sake, it was balance. It was justice for every child who had been silenced, for every innocent soul buried under lies and jealousy. She was not striking out blindly, she was answering the call of the spirits who had pulled her from the grave. As days passed, she no longer walked as the fragile girl who once bent beneath the weight of her stepmother's commands. She walked with quiet strength, her eyes sharper, her movements deliberate. To those who might have seen her from afar, she appeared like an ordinary girl recovering from hardship. But inside, a storm brewed, carefully contained, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. She was no longer dreaming of escape. Her heart now dreamed of return, not to beg for acceptance but to claim her power. She knew her stepmother would never expect her to rise from the dead, and when that day came, the terror in the woman's eyes would be the sweetest justice. Until then the girl listened, learned, and prepared. Each dream, each whisper, each vision was another stone in the foundation of her revenge. She was no longer merely surviving, she was becoming the vessel of a plan that would change everything. In the days and nights that followed her awakening, the girl felt a change deep within her, as though the very earth that had once tried to swallow her alive was now feeding her with its hidden strength. She no longer walked with the timid steps of a child who lived in fear of her stepmother's cruelty. Her body was still marked by scars of hardship, her hands raw from years of labor, but each scar seemed to carry power instead of weakness. Every ache in her bones reminded her of what she had endured, and every memory of betrayal hardened her resolve to never again be broken. She knew she had been spared by the spirits for a purpose, and that purpose was unfolding like dawn after the longest night. She began by teaching herself skills she had once been denied. Where her stepmother had mocked her clumsiness or weakness, she now practiced in silence until her movements became fluid, sharp, and controlled. She learned to weave ropes from grass with fingers that had once been forced to scrub floors. She shaped small weapons from stones and wood, testing their balance, understanding their use. She studied the plants of the forest not as chores to be collected, but as allies, discovering which leaves could heal wounds, which roots could bring sleep, and which flowers carried poisons so subtle they seemed like whispers of death. Every lesson was gathered patiently, carefully, like a hunter waiting for the right prey. But it was not only in the physical world that she grew. Each night, as she lay under the stars or within the quiet of the forest, she felt the presence of something more. The spirits who had saved her from death had not abandoned her. They came to her in dreams, their shapes luminous and commanding, their voices firm yet filled with an ancient tenderness. They taught her how to listen to silence, how to read the shifting of the wind, how to sense danger before it revealed itself. They showed her visions of battles won not by brute force, but by patience, cunning, and the unshakable strength of one who carries the truth within her. The girl absorbed their teachings, her heart hardening into something unyielding, a vessel of determination stronger than any chain. And then allies began to appear. Some were human, others beyond the world of flesh. In the forest, she crossed paths with an old woman, shunned by the village and whispered to be a witch. But when the girl approached her without fear, the old woman saw the mark of the spirits upon her. She became a quiet mentor, teaching her chants that could steady the heart, charms that could confuse enemies, and the secrets of herbs that could wound or heal. From her, the girl learned that true power was not just in strength, but in the knowledge of when and how to strike. In the eyes of the crone, she saw not pity but recognition, as if the woman knew this girl's destiny was greater than her suffering. There were others too, beings who belonged neither to the village nor to the human world. At night, in the hush of the trees, she saw flickers of light that moved like fireflies but carried shapes of warriors and guardians. They circled her in silence, their presence fierce, protective. Once, as she sat in meditation, a voice like thunder spoke from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You are no longer prey. You are the storm they cannot endure." The words rang inside her until her heart no longer trembled at the thought of her stepmother's face. Instead, she felt fire ignite in her veins, a calm, controlled fire that promised justice. As she grew, she also began to notice the way her presence changed the air around her. Birds that once scattered at human footsteps lingered when she passed. The wind shifted as though it carried her secrets. The ground seemed to hum beneath her feet, a reminder of the grave that had failed to keep her. She was no longer merely a girl, she was a vessel of something larger, something eternal, and those who crossed her path could feel it. Even the shadows seemed to bend around her, acknowledging her as their kin. Her heart, once tender and bruised, now hardened like tempered steel. She still remembered the days when she wept quietly into her hands, yearning for kindness, for love, for belonging. But now that yearning had been replaced by determination. She no longer sought pity or even understanding. She sought only balance, justice, the restoration of the order that had been broken when her stepmother's cruelty had condemned her. And in her chest, the steady beat of her heart echoed a vow: never again would she be powerless. Never again would she bow to cruelty. The more she prepared, the clearer her path became. Her visions were no longer simply scattered images of vengeance but structured, guiding her to the moment she would return. She saw the villagers' faces in her mind, their disbelief, their awe, their terror as they realized she had come back, not broken but remade. She imagined the chains of fear turning against her enemies, the lies unraveling in public, and the stepmother's voice faltering for the first time. These were not fantasies, they were promises of what would come, sealed by the whispers of the spirits and the fire in her soul. With every passing day, the girl became less a victim of her past and more a force of reckoning. Her skills grew sharper, her allies stronger, her spirit harder. She walked through the forest no longer as a lost child, but as one preparing for war. And in the silence of her thoughts, she repeated the same vow over and over. She would return, and when she did, she would not simply survive. She would bring justice, and the world would never forget her name. When the day of her return finally came, the village lay bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, its familiar huts standing against the horizon like silent witnesses waiting for a story to unfold. The girl, no longer the frail shadow they had last seen, approached the boundary with a steady stride that seemed both human and otherworldly. Her steps pressed into the dust, but it was as though the earth itself carried her forward. Word of her presence spread like fire, carried first by a child who caught sight of her figure on the far road, then by women at the wells who whispered with wide eyes, and finally by men who dropped their tools as their gazes fixed on her with disbelief. No one could comprehend how the one they had watched buried under cruelty, the one they thought gone forever, now walked back into their midst upright, stronger, cloaked in a silence that was louder than any cry. She looked changed in ways that words could not easily explain. Her frame was still slim, her face still that of the young girl they had known, but her posture radiated a quiet power that demanded respect. Her eyes, once filled with tears of exhaustion and longing, now glowed with something deeper, sharper, a glint that unsettled even the boldest hearts. There was no bitterness in her expression, yet her calm smile seemed to hold secrets beyond comprehension. Her clothing bore the signs of a life lived outside the safety of the village, woven from the wilderness itself, stitched with patience and endurance. Around her neck hung a simple charm given by the spirits, and though it looked plain, villagers swore they saw it glimmer faintly as the light touched it. Those who had once mocked her froze where they stood. Murmurs rose, half in awe, half in fear, as people whispered to one another, was she really alive? Was she a spirit now? Had she returned to punish or to forgive? Old women muttered prayers under their breath while younger men stepped back cautiously, unsure whether to welcome her or flee. Her presence unsettled everyone, not because she shouted or accused, but because silence clung to her like a storm cloud holding back thunder. It was a silence that promised change. Children, curious and fearless in their innocence, were the first to inch closer. They tugged at their mother's hands, whispering questions about whether the girl was truly human. Some reached out to touch her garments, and when she met their eyes they saw not anger but a warmth that reassured them. It was as though she carried both the weight of vengeance and the tenderness of protection within her, balanced in a way no ordinary villager could understand. Her smile toward the children was soft, but when her gaze shifted to the adults who had turned away from her suffering, those same eyes burned with a reminder that she had not forgotten. The stepmother was among the last to hear of her return. When the news reached her ears, her heart clenched with a terror she tried desperately to disguise. She pushed through the gathering crowd, expecting to find a frightened girl crawling back, begging for scraps of mercy. But when her eyes fell on the young woman standing tall in the village square, her lips dried and her words failed. It was as though the earth itself had betrayed her by allowing the girl to rise. For a brief moment their eyes met, and in that gaze the stepmother felt the ground beneath her shift. The chains of power she once wielded through lies and cruelty dissolved like dust, replaced by a dread she could not shake. The villagers, caught between fascination and fear, did not know how to address her. Some bowed their heads slightly, unsure whether respect or apology was required. Others stepped back, unwilling to meet her eyes at all. Yet, without raising her voice, without demanding their acknowledgement, she commanded the space entirely. Every glance she cast seemed deliberate, each step a statement, every breath a reminder that she was no longer the girl who could be dismissed or abused. She was something greater, something born of betrayal and remade by forces beyond comprehension. Night fell and still she stood in the village square, the crowd unable to disperse. A fire was lit nearby, and its flames flickered against her face, casting her in shifting light that made her seem both mortal and spirit. The whispers grew louder, some swearing she carried the spirits of ancestors in her shadow, others convinced she had returned to seek revenge. Yet when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying across the square without effort. She did not accuse or cry out. She simply told them that she had returned, stronger than before, guided by powers they could not understand. Her words were few, but they carried the weight of truth and no one dared to challenge her. From that night, the village could no longer look at her as they once had. Her return was not just the reappearance of a girl once wronged, but the arrival of a figure who embodied the strength of survival, the quiet of patience, and the inevitability of justice. The villagers could not explain it, but they knew her presence was now woven into the fabric of their fate. She was no longer merely part of their community, she was above it, a force of balance, a reminder that cruelty carries a price, and that innocence, when touched by spirits, becomes a power no one can escape. The girl's return to the village was not just a return of flesh and bone but of a spirit sharpened like a blade. She did not come to simply exist among them as before. She had endured betrayal, cruelty, and an attempt on her life, and now she carried within her not only the weight of that suffering but also the fire of justice. Her stepmother, the architect of her misery, had grown comfortable in the girl's absence, boasting of her success and assuming she had erased the girl from memory. But whispers began spreading in the air even before the girl revealed herself fully: strange winds, shadows moving at dusk, animals stirring uneasily near the stepmother's hut. It was as though the earth itself anticipated what was about to happen. The girl's plan was not born out of rash anger. She had thought of every detail, guided by dreams and visions that showed her stepmother's downfall. She understood the weaknesses of those who wronged her, their greed, their vanity, their fears. And it was through these weaknesses that she would dismantle them, piece by piece, until none could deny the hand of justice. At night, she moved like a shadow through the village, planting small signs that unsettled the guilty. She placed charms in their paths, symbols only they would interpret as omens. A broken gourd at the doorstep, ashes scattered across thresholds, and whispering voices carried by the wind at midnight, each one tightened the noose of fear around her stepmother's heart. Her stepmother began to feel the shift first. Sleep deserted her. Food tasted bitter. Even in the brightness of day, she felt eyes upon her. When she sat by the fire, sparks leapt toward her as though mocking her. Chickens avoided her shadow. The girl had not yet spoken a word, but already her revenge had begun to bloom like poison in her enemy's veins. The accomplices who once encouraged the stepmother's cruelty also began to crumble under the weight of guilt. They muttered to one another in secret, wondering if the girl had truly returned or if her spirit had risen from the grave with vengeance as its only desire. Some tried to deny it, but each night the evidence grew. The girl chose her moments carefully. She appeared first at the village square, her figure standing tall and composed, her eyes holding the kind of strength that made even the most arrogant look away. Her stepmother, upon seeing her, nearly collapsed, convinced that this was not flesh but ghost. The girl said nothing at first. Silence was her weapon, and in that silence her enemies drowned. The villagers, once complicit in their silence when she was condemned, now whispered nervously among themselves, feeling shame and fear intertwine. The girl's presence alone unsettled them more deeply than any spoken curse. But her plan was not to frighten them alone, it was to unmask them. She began weaving subtle traps of truth. At gatherings, she would ask innocent questions, leading her stepmother to reveal contradictions in her stories. She would bring small tokens of the past, scraps of cloth, broken tools, things her stepmother had claimed were lost, and lay them before the elders. Each object was like a stone, building a wall of evidence against her. The accomplices cracked under pressure, their voices trembling as they tried to cover their tracks. Fear pushed them to betray one another, and soon the stepmother's allies abandoned her, leaving her exposed. At night, the girl returned to the places where she once suffered, walking with deliberate calm. She lit fires at crossroads, her silhouette dancing in the flames as though she were calling upon the ancestors. The villagers watched in awe and dread, believing the spirits had indeed chosen her as their vessel. Her stepmother, in contrast, grew pale and thin, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She began to see the girl everywhere, even in reflections of water, even in shadows on the wall. Her own mind became her prison, crafted perfectly by the girl's unrelenting presence. Finally, the girl struck directly. She stood before the entire village and spoke of the past, of her suffering, of the cruelty she endured, and of the attempt on her life. Her voice, steady and sharp, left no room for denial. The spirits themselves seemed to echo her words, as sudden winds tore through the crowd and flames flared higher in the fire pit. Her stepmother tried to deny everything, but her trembling voice betrayed her. The villagers who once chose silence, now cried for justice. The girl had turned their fear into fury, their shame into action. Her plan reached its conclusion when the stepmother was brought before the same judgment circle that had once condemned the girl. This time, however, the roles were reversed. The girl did not demand death or blood. Her revenge was greater than that. She demanded that her stepmother live with the weight of her own evil exposed. She stripped her of respect, of dignity, and of power. The villagers cast her out, refusing her food, shelter, or companionship. She became a ghost among the living, wandering alone with the knowledge that her victim had not only survived but triumphed. The girl's revenge was not swift but deliberate, a slow tightening of a web that crushed her stepmother without a blade being drawn. And as the villagers looked upon her, they realized she had become something far more than a girl wronged. She had become the embodiment of justice itself, a living reminder that cruelty may wound but it never wins. The day of reckoning dawned like a silent drumbeat across the village, each ray of sunlight falling on the huts as if highlighting the final act in a long and tragic play. The girl, no longer the fragile victim of her stepmother's malice, stood at the center of the village square. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, surveyed the crowd and fixed on the woman who had once sought to erase her very existence. The stepmother, who had basked for years in assumed triumph, now trembled before the presence of the girl, her face a mask of disbelief, fear, and the slow, creeping realization that the power she had wielded through lies and cruelty was crumbling irreversibly. The villagers had gathered reluctantly, drawn by whispers and rumors, but once they laid eyes on the girl, the air itself seemed charged with an unspoken command. She did not raise her voice at first. Her calm was a weapon, sharper than any threat or shout. Then, slowly, methodically, she began to recount the truths that had been buried with silence and fear, the secret schemes, the nights of torment, the attempts on her life, and the countless injustices inflicted in the name of control. Every word carried weight, anchored by the undeniable evidence she presented. Objects recovered, hidden witnesses, and the subtle but undeniable signs of spiritual favor that had accompanied her return. Her stepmother's initial reaction was to protest, to dismiss the accusations as baseless, but the carefully constructed layers of truth left her no room to maneuver. The villagers who once followed her lead could not deny what they saw. Each lie, each deception, each act of cruelty was laid bare before their eyes, highlighted by the girl's calm but unwavering narration. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, a wave of realization rolling through the villagers, awakening their sense of justice. Faces that had once looked away now stared, horror-struck, as the depth of the stepmother's crimes became undeniable. The stepmother's desperation escalated quickly. She tried to turn the narrative, pointing fingers at others, concocting wild explanations, and invoking old traditions to shield herself from accountability. Yet every attempt only revealed more of her duplicity. The girl, anticipating these maneuvers, countered calmly with irrefutable evidence and the subtle authority granted by her survival and the unseen forces that had guided her. Every lie was shattered, every feeble excuse dismantled, until the stepmother could no longer claim innocence or control. Her power, which had once seemed unassailable, was stripped away piece by piece, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way she had never known. The villagers, previously silent or complicit, now moved as one to ensure justice was delivered. They stepped forward to reclaim the dignity and moral order the stepmother had violated, ensuring that her punishment was neither arbitrary nor cruel beyond measure, yet undeniable in its consequence. The girl, though now strong and empowered, did not exact her own vengeance through violence. Instead, she let the collective weight of truth and morality act as the instrument of punishment. The stepmother was publicly stripped of her status and her respect, shunned by the very people she had once manipulated with fear and deceit. The elders oversaw her removal, ensuring that her position in the community, once bolstered by intimidation, was replaced by accountability and the cold lesson of cause and effect. As the day progressed, the stepmother's allies, who had facilitated or silently condoned her schemes, faced their own reckoning. The girl's meticulous planning had revealed their complicity. They were confronted with the undeniable evidence of their participation, their own shame and fear magnified under the scrutiny of the villagers' eyes and the girl's composed gaze. Each accomplice experienced the repercussions of their choices, some exiled, others stripped of property, influence, or trust, ensuring that the ripple of justice reached all who had touched her life with cruelty. Yet the girl's triumph was not only in punishment, but in the restoration of balance. She walked among the villagers, demonstrating the power of truth and resilience. Where once fear had dictated behavior, now respect and awe followed her footsteps. The stepmother, reduced to a figure of disgrace and isolation, could no longer command influence over anyone. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now faltered under the weight of truth and consequence. Her eyes, which had sought to intimidate and belittle, now reflected only regret and helplessness. The villagers, witnessing the undeniable cosmic and moral justice, learned that cruelty carries consequences and that innocence, when guided by courage and aided by forces beyond human comprehension, can rise above oppression. They saw in the girl not merely a survivor, but a beacon of hope and righteousness. Her survival, her return, and her deliberate orchestration of justice transformed her from a victim into a symbol, a living testament that evil cannot endure when confronted by truth and resilience. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the square, the stepmother had been removed from power, her influence nullified. The village, once complicit in silence, now stood united in recognition of the girl's courage and the undeniable justice she had wrought. And in that moment she did not revel in her enemy's downfall but in the restoration of order, in the knowledge that truth had prevailed, and that her suffering had not been in vain. Her stepmother's downfall was complete, not merely through punishment, but through exposure, through the dismantling of her lies, and through the undeniable reassertion of justice. The girl, empowered and resolute, had orchestrated a reckoning that was both fair and devastatingly final, a reminder that no cruelty, no matter how deep or long sustained, could escape the force of truth. The village learned that day that justice, patient and deliberate, guided by courage and the unseen hand of fate, could not be denied.